Thank you for joining me today to think with you about how to take care of yourselves during what continues to be a very challenging time. My name is Caroline Gibbs and I'm a clinical psychologist with the Children's Wellbeing Service for South West London and St George's. Today I'm going to be asking you to reflect on how you've been coping with the challenges we're facing, where things are feeling okay and where perhaps some small changes might contribute to your wellbeing. So let's take a quick look at the agenda for today. We're going to be covering three key areas. Firstly, we'll take a look at emotion regulation and the window of tolerance. And some of this may be familiar to you, but it's helpful just to have a quick reminder. We're then going to think more about your personal and individual well-being and how to replenish and stock up on your resilience. So here we're really viewing resilience as something you build up rather than something that you either have or don't have. So it's something that will grow and deplete, and there are a number of ways that we can strengthen our supply. And finally, we'll be taking a look at resilience in the context of working specifically in education. So I'll be sharing some research with you and we'll think together about how we can apply this to your setting. So when you're working in education, why is it important to focus on staff wellbeing? Well, we know that working in education is much like working in the NHS. Schools are often understaffed. You're required to juggle and prioritise large numbers of competing tasks. You're often expected to keep going in what can feel like a very relentless environment. And there's an expectation that you will go above and beyond. And in recent years, and perhaps particularly now more than ever during the pandemic, you're being asked to support students and their families with emotional and social difficulties, as well as those relating to a child's education. You're often faced with new government targets and are therefore required to adapt to new ways of working at quite a fast pace. And this has been particularly true during the pandemic, whilst also, I'm sure, managing your own personal challenges to contend with, whether COVID related or otherwise. So with that in mind, I'd like to start the session today by slowing right down and allowing yourself the chance to move into a slightly more reflective space. So this short through a meditation, and if you think it will help you to focus, do feel free to close your eyes whilst you're listening.
Allow yourself to be still for a moment and start breathing deeply in through the nose and out through the mouth. Don't worry about how loud your breathing is or if anyone can hear it. And there's no need to try and ignore any noise going on around you or to try too hard to clear your mind. Imagine yourself as a rock in the middle of a stream. All the noise and commotion that may or may not be going on around you just washes over you without having any effect. Focus on your breath. Think about how anything that has negatively affected your day up until this point, and with each out-breath you are simply going to imagine any unnecessary stress these events are causing you to feel just ease away. Breathe in and observe how you feel. Breathe out and feel it easing from your mind. Now, still breathing deeply, take a moment to visualize how you want the rest of the day to go. Imagine achieving any goals and successes at the end of the day and how that will make you feel. Create a mental picture of what that looks like and take a moment to play that out in your mind. Whenever you're ready, bring the exercise to a close and open your eyes.
So hopefully that exercise has allowed you just to step away from your busy day just while we're focusing on this presentation. Now I'm sure that many of you will identify with this cartoon, And there has been a real recognition that demands of this year will have understandably been having an effect on the educational staff's well-being. Being under continuous pressure with limited relief can lead to emotional, psychological and physical health difficulties, no matter how much resilience you've been able to store up. I'm sure that many of you were drawn to the world of education because you feel passionately about sharing knowledge and skills and supporting young children to learn and have a good start in life. This responsibility, a sense of duty, is perhaps one of the things that brought you into the field and gives you an ongoing sense of pride in your work. But it can also push us to work beyond our capacity and to the extent that we neglect our own needs. Ultimately, you cannot support others, at least for any extended period of time, if you are running on empty. We cannot effectively take care of other people if we're not taking care of ourselves. So just take a moment to think about this idea. Can you recall a time where you've been asked to cover for a colleague off sick and have felt irritated or perhaps resentment? Or perhaps a parent has shared something personal about a struggle they're experiencing and you felt indifferent or maybe even annoyed. Have you struggled to complete tasks that would ordinarily be quite straightforward? Or have you experienced critical thoughts, either about yourself, your work, or the work of your colleagues? These can all be signs that we're running on empty, that our oxygen is depleting, and that we cannot take on another task, whether that's relational or practical. So we're going to start by looking at your typical stress response and how you can regulate and manage stress. This slide shows us the window of tolerance, and every person, adult and child, has a window of tolerance. And we use this phrase to describe our psychological, physiological arousal. When we're sitting inside our window of tolerance, we feel able to deal with life stresses and strains. And even if we do feel under pressure, we feel that we're able to cope and we're able to regulate ourselves. The size of our window of tolerance and the range of our regulation skills will vary quite a bit from person to person. And the size of our windows will also fluctuate across our lifetime, depending on what's going on at the time. But the good news is we can always learn new ways to replenish or upgrade our windows. So the larger, more full up and replenished our window of tolerance, the more stress it takes to push us outside into either a hyper-aroused state or hypo-aroused state. A smaller or more depleted window results in a faster swing outside of this comfort zone. And whether we move to this hyper or hypo-aroused state is totally out of our control. We're not able to choose our stress response, and it's based on a range of complex factors. So you might quickly identify yourself as someone who moves up into fight-flight mode. So this is the hyper-aroused state. And this is where you might begin to feel overwhelmed, panicky, vigilant, you might feel anxious or perhaps frustrated. And I would say that most people tend to recognise this as their typical stress response. So physically, you might feel hot, jittery, you might feel nauseous or on edge. And sometimes you might even find yourself doing more work or putting yourself into further stressful situations, even to the surprise of those around you. And that's because this adrenaline can become addictive, and this productivity can be a way of avoiding further anxiety. So you get this sense of, well, I'm doing something. For some people, though, your stress response may be to move down into freeze mode. So here you're more likely to become a bit passive, withdrawn, or perhaps shut down. You might feel empty or numb, and physically you'll feel slow, heavy, and lacking in energy. Whatever our stress response, the front of our brain, which is responsible for the more advanced cognitive function, goes into the sort of hibernation mode or shutdown mode. And this impairs problem solving and decision making, which makes it harder to then climb back into the safe haven of our window. And when we're outside our window of tolerance, and as we can see here, it all becomes extremely challenging to communicate effectively. Our rational mind cannot be reached, and we're being guided very strongly by emotion and those physiological symptoms in our body. And for some of us, we really struggle to recognise when this response has been triggered. So we continue to try and communicate with very little success. And our ability to empathise or be curious about how others are feeling or what they might be thinking is also reduced. And this really stops us being able to connect with those around us. So I'd like you to think now about your individual window of tolerance and to support you to recognise when you're going up into fight flight or down into freeze. And it's really important to know which is your stress response, because we're going to think about particular ideas about how to bring yourself back into your window of tolerance. And there are some slight variations in terms of the techniques you might use. So on this slide and the next, you're going to see a list of common signs for both hyperarousal, so that's the fight flight mode, and hypoarousal, freeze mode. So feel free to pause the video over each slide and you can just jot down which of the symptoms you identify with. And if you like, you can also rate how intensely you feel these. So a scale of 1 to 5, where 5 would be the most severe or extreme. And once you've done this for both categories, it may become clearer to you as to which you tend to veer towards during times of stress, although some people do experience both depending on the circumstance. So the slide you see here in the red, this is the hyperarousal fight-flight mode. And this slide here shows the freeze response, the hypoarousal. And again, do feel free to just pause the video if you need to take a bit of time to look at the categories. Okay, so we're now going to come on to things that can keep your window large in size and well stocked. But let's just take a moment to think about how to bring yourself back into your window of tolerance once you've left. So we call these our emotion regulation skills. And there are many, many different ways of regulating your emotional and physiological state. And some of these techniques are quite flexible and can be used anywhere at all, whereas some are much more context specific. So you might be only able to do them if you're at home. And the key really is to have a range of skills to draw from and really get to know what works best for you. So it's worth trying a few different things out in different circumstances to see which really helps you to kind of bring things down or reconnect back into your window of tolerance. And as I've said, some regulation strategies are better suited to re-regulating fight-flight mode, and some are more effective when you're in freeze mode. So generally speaking, in fight-flight, you want to calm things down. So for some people, this might mean engaging in slower, more calming activities. But for others, actually releasing some of that adrenaline that's circulating in your body can be effective. And for those who tend to go down into freeze mode, really here it's about reconnecting to the environment around you. And so heightening or alerting the senses is the goal here. So here are some examples of regulation strategies for coming down from fight-flight mode. So have a look through the list and perhaps make a note of things that you know work well for you. And again, pause the video if you need to and think about maybe there's some here that you could try out, or think about those that you already know work for you that might not be on this list. And here we have some examples of regulation strategies for moving up out of freeze mode. And again, have a look through the list and see what you might have tried before, what you'd be interested in giving a go. So as you can see from the list, this is much more about reconnecting and activating the senses. Okay, so we're now going to turn to think about what will help to strengthen, replenish and widen your window of tolerance. So these are kind of stocking up skills. And we're going to look at this a bit more generally before thinking about how you can do this within your school context specifically. So a key message I'd like you to take away today is all about the impact of nature on resilience and mental health. And I'd like to thank Dr. Alison Greenwood at the Trust for the following slides. So there's been some really interesting research in this field, particularly in recent years, but also going right back into the 1980s. And so sticking with the theme of windows, this is an old study, but really quite fascinating. So in 1984, a researcher compared patients who were recovering after surgery, and half of these patients recovered in a room with a view of nature or green spaces, and half had a window looking out to a brick wall. And what they found was that those with a window looking out to nature requested fewer strong painkillers, made fewer complaints to nurses, and were discharged on average 2 to 3 days earlier. And we often underestimate the restorative impact of nature, but it's really important to remember that we evolved in nature and we therefore have a biological need to really connect with it. It's where we've lived for most of our time on Earth. And now the importance of sunlight is something that's quite widely recognised as a benefit to humans with regards to things like vitamin D or serotonin levels, and that's that happy hormone. But there are other factors that can boost our emotional and psychological well-being, as well as the physical benefits of being outside. So this is some really interesting research into phytoncides. Phytoncides are naturally occurring chemical compounds, and they're secreted by plants and trees to protect themselves from threats such as bacteria or insects. And in recent years, some research has shown that there's a really positive impact of breathing in phytoncides. And this can be seen in the list here. So all about boosting your immune functioning, decreasing your levels of cortisol, which is your stress hormone, supporting increased hours of sleep, lowering heart rate and blood pressure, and really kind of reducing that fight-flight response and stimulating a more pleasant and calm mood. And you might have heard about those in Japanese, they call this forest bathing, and that's how they access these phytoncides. So for your maximum impact, ideally you want to visit green spaces a couple of times a week and really engage your senses by focusing on the nature around you. Although even when you're stuck indoors, you can still benefit from inhaling phytoncide oils, and actually a number of hospitals in the US are now diffusing essential oils which contain phytoncide, with some impressive findings, including significantly reduced workplace stress amongst staff and a reported increase in energy levels. So this is quite a handy way to think about how often and in what kind of settings are you engaging with nature. And you can look at your daily, weekly, monthly or annual basis. And it's all about varying the locations, varying where you're going, what kind of nature you're engaging with. So here's an example here. And so it looks through the sort of day-to-day things, maybe just appreciating the weather outside, thinking about houseplants or looking out through the window, and then moving up to sort of the annual experiences you might have. And this might be just 1 or 2 times throughout the year where you can really get into a sort of awe-inspiring or more sort of interesting viewpoint. So it's really worth thinking about how can you increase your contact sort of outside of work, but also during your working week. So whether that's perhaps going for a walk with colleagues at some point throughout the school day, having plants in the classroom or around the school, maybe ensuring that where you're sat for marking towards the end of the day means that you're sat facing a window so that you can look outside, or perhaps incorporating some outside lessons into the calendar, or really just taking in the nature whilst you're outside on playground duty. Okay, so we're now going to take a quick look at some of the other big hitters for replenishing your window of tolerance and really building up your resilience. And many of these will be familiar to you, but I just would like you to imagine that each of the categories are a piece of armour, and that the more you address these, the better equipped you are to really cope with a stressful job in what is a very challenging time. So as I read through the categories, perhaps just think about how satisfied are you with each item, maybe on a scale of 1 to 10. And if you feel that it's lower than a 6 or 7, think about how might you be able to strengthen this area. And this really isn't about being the perfect human being. None of us manage all of these perfectly all of the time. It's just not possible. This exercise really isn't supposed to make you feel worse, but it's just about thinking, where are the small changes that you can make that over time might lead to a bigger difference? So we'll start with sleep, because really it's so important not to underestimate the value of sleep, because we have so much research to show us how important it is for our physical, emotional and psychological health. So it's really one of the most important things to address. And if this is an area where you know you're perhaps not getting the best sleep that you might be able to, it's the one I would suggest you tackle first. So adults should aim for 7 to 9 hours of sleep per night. And if you're nowhere near this, as I said, this is something I would really encourage you to focus on. And this slide here just shows some kind of common sleep hygiene tips that might just be the thing you need to help you to get a better night's sleep. So this is all about following a consistent sleep routine, really limiting your alcohol intake, taking regular exercise, ensuring that you're not looking at gadgets or screens for 30 to 60 minutes before you go to bed, thinking about the environment that you're going to bed in. So if you can, invest in some blackout blinds, keep it nice and dark, and think about the temperature. Usually a cooler room is actually better. Also important to think about how much caffeine you're drinking, especially in the afternoon. And thinking about that sort of daylight, this kind of links nicely with the nature slides that we've just looked at. So how can you get outside and get yourself some sunlight, especially in the winter months? And finally, something that people kind of feel sounds slightly counterintuitive, but if you've gone to bed and you're not asleep after 20 minutes, actually what we would suggest is to get up and out of bed and do something calm and relaxing, perhaps reading a book in low light, so no screens, for about 15 minutes or until you start to feel sleepy, and then go back into bed and try again. So you're not lying there kind of tossing and turning or fretting over not falling asleep. Okay, so looking after your physical health, we know now that this really does also have a direct link to your mental health. And this is particularly important at the time of a global pandemic. And it's something that is often so easily neglected when you have a busy job and home life. So if you're unwell, do take care of yourself, allow yourself to rest and recover, because pushing yourself beyond your limits is likely to lead to burnout. So eating well, this is a tough one, because when we're under stress and when we're stretched for time, eating healthily and regular meals tends to get pushed a little bit further down the priority list. And when it's cold and dark in the winter seasons, comforting foods are often a way of making ourselves feel a bit better. So really moderation is the key here. I'm definitely one for advocating food as a source of comfort, but just being mindful about how often are you turning to sugary foods as a solution to stress, and trying to kind of balance it out as best you can. And the same obviously goes for alcohol. And exercise, again, this is one we all sort of know about, but it can be hard, particularly again in this time of winter. But it's so beneficial for our mental health and also for our sleep as well and our energy levels. So we want to be aiming to be physically active in some way every day. And the NHS recommend that you do some sort of strengthening exercises a couple of days a week. And that over the course of the week, you do about 150 minutes of moderate exercise. So that's perhaps brisk walking or riding a bike, or you could do 75 minutes of more kind of vigorous activity. So that might be a HIIT class, running, jogging or spinning. And really trying to reduce the time spent sitting or lying down. So breaking that up with some periods of getting up and moving around throughout the day. Okay, in relationships. So we know obviously COVID has massively impacted on our ability to connect with friends and loved ones. And having a very busy and stressful job often results in less time, but also less energy to socialise. Despite this, the importance of connection and shared experiences with our loved ones is actually so vital for our well-being and our resilience. So this is just a reminder to really think about how you can reconnect with your loved ones, obviously within kind of current guidelines, but perhaps particularly when you do have an opportunity to have some time away from school, perhaps over the holidays. And we'll also come on to thinking about relationships with your colleagues in a moment. And finally, mastery. So this is all about whether you're experiencing a sense of accomplishment or mastery on a regular basis. So we'll think a bit about this in relation to your job a bit later, but it's also important that you experience this feeling outside of work too. And it really doesn't have to be anything major. It might be cooking a new recipe or trying out a new hobby, or even something really kind of mundane like reorganising the fridge. So it doesn't matter at all how big or small this is. It's more about eliciting that sort of slightly self-satisfied or proud feeling that you have when you've accomplished or completed an activity. Okay, so we've spent a lot of the session so far thinking about your personal and individual resilience and how we might strengthen this. But it's now time to think about this in the context of school and your relationships with one another as colleagues. So stress, adversity and life's challenges require humans to adapt and to think flexibly and creatively. And coronavirus has really tested us on this. So if you think about what you've achieved as a school over the last year, having to move lessons online, but also remaining open and supportive of key worker children, supporting families during lockdown, whilst also supporting your own families and perhaps managing personal challenges, having to tolerate this almost constant sense of uncertainty whilst also being reactive to the changing rules, restrictions and guidelines that you're facing, and then supporting the children to come back to school after a long gap, and also kind of being forced to continue supposedly as normal whilst much of the country experienced a further lockdown. So we're all born with the capacity to develop resilience, but when we're faced with negative circumstances, whether these are connected to personal or professional factors, our resilience can be either enhanced or inhibited by the nature of settings that we're working in and the people that we're working with, so those relationships that we have with our colleagues. And this is a UK research project that specifically looked at resilience in teaching staff. And what they found was that those who work in education reported 3 overarching factors that influence the development or decline in staff resilience. So these were related to personal factors, so things outside of work, those that were situated in school, and also this third category of professional factors. So this was all about how the individual's values and beliefs relate to the external policies and agendas, and how these impacted on professional identity. So perhaps things that the government might put in place, or new initiatives or guidelines that you have to follow. How does this fit with your beliefs and values about your role within your school? And perhaps unsurprisingly, the more extreme the scenario, the more energy it took as a teacher to manage, and the more likely it was to test their resilience. So as you might expect, when teachers experience relatively mild fluctuations, so positive home life, few problems at school, not too many problems with behaviour, getting on well with colleagues, and feeling kind of strong in their sense of self as a professional, the less they needed to call upon their resilience. But what was important was that the capacity to be resilient was influenced by these factors, and that it was very fluctuating and kind of ever-changing. So here were the kind of key things that they found in the research that would impact upon someone working in education and the sort of levels of their resilience. And that's those in blue. And I've just added a few extra in yellow, which relate to the conversations that I've had in sort of recent months with educational staff. So some of these examples relate specifically to a school environment, so that in the situated factors, so things like pupil behaviour or school culture, whereas other examples cut across all 3, so things like relationships or communication or self-efficacy. So I'd now like you just to take a bit of time to reflect on each of these categories and think about which might be fueling your resilience and which is maybe threatening it or depleting it. So I'm going to show an example of how you might go about this on the next slide. So here we have Beth. So we've kind of categorised these into the 3 sections, so the personal, the situated and the professional. And then we've got these 2 columns here to think about what's fueling Beth's resilience and what's threatening it. So for Beth, for her personal category, what's fueling her resilience is the strong relationship she has with her partner. She's enjoying spending time with her children. She's continuing to enjoy an art club online, and she's taking fairly regular exercise. But the things that are threatening her resilience are not being able to see her parents and other family members, and her husband is currently on a reduced salary due to COVID. And her situated within school factors, so fueling her resilience is strong leadership at the school. She's getting on well with her colleagues, she's got a lovely class, and she feels confident in her ability. But the things that are threatening it are she's really missing spending time with colleagues in the staff room. She continues to have a very large workload and she's having limited time to have a break. And there's been quite a lot of staff sickness, so she's feeling under pressure to do more. And then finally, the third category, the professional. So fueling her resilience, she's got that strong sense of responsibility and duty to support pupils during this particularly challenging time. But the threats to it are these constantly changing rules and restrictions that are coming from above, and she's experiencing too many targets and related admin. So using these common categories, which can both threaten or replenish resilience, have a look and see if you can complete your own grid. So again, this is something you might be able to do now, or if you haven't got time, perhaps this is an activity that you could take away to do at a later date. And I'll just remind you of those key categories on the next slide here. Okay, so once you've looked at the threats and the fuel for your resilience, and we know that these will exist always in some form, although hopefully to a lesser degree in the future. What we then need to come on to think about is what can you do? How can you become an active participant in the development and sustainment of your resilience? So this is about taking individual steps, but also taking steps alongside your colleagues to strengthen yourselves, one another, and yourselves as a collective team of staff. So these questions here are really to get you thinking about how you can begin to make some changes. And as I said before, nobody's expecting you to do all of these things or make endless improvements. It's about what might make a difference now, what's actually achievable. And again, this might be an activity you want to do on an individual basis, or it might be helpful to do this alongside your colleagues or even as a whole staff group. So just to give you some examples of things to reflect on. So what are the factors that might help to increase your personal resilience? So these are the topics we covered earlier. So exercise, diet, sleep, how much nature you're getting access to, how can you spend more time in nature? Also, what might help you to increase your self-efficacy at work? So this is actually came up as a really important point in the research. So your self-efficacy is really that sense of belief that you can do a good job. So here, getting feedback from colleagues, perhaps giving feedback to colleagues or taking on new responsibilities or a new project are things that can really help to fuel resilience. Where you don't have control over something, how can you protect your well-being? Perhaps using mindfulness or relaxation strategies. How can you increase connections and strengthen relationships with others, both inside and outside your work environment? How can you contribute to a positive school culture? So how can you give supportive feedback to your colleagues? How might you be able to recognise and appreciate a colleague who might have gone above and beyond, or even just done something quite small but really made a difference to your day? Perhaps you could arrange video breakfasts or lunches with colleagues where you have limited contact at the moment. What might help you to establish a better work-life balance? How might you be able to cope with ever-changing restriction rules, targets, or data requirements from the government? And really importantly, who might you need to communicate with, both in and outside of school, to add fuel to your resilience or manage any existing threats? So how can you increase the conversations that you're having about this, both within and outside your school environment? So let's go back to Beth here. Here she's identified some additional items that are both realistic and achievable to add fuel to her resilience based on the concepts that we've discussed. So she's going to add to her personal fuel by spending some Christmas time to really focus on getting her sleep on track. She's going to reconnect with some of her friends, and she's going to go to Richmond Park with the family. And then minimising or reducing the impact of these existing threats, she's going to arrange some family Zoom sessions. If she's allowed, she's going to prioritise a visit to her parents and her sister over Christmas. And with regards to her husband being on a reduced salary, she's going to kind of use mindfulness to try and prevent rumination and excessive worry about this, because it really is something that she's not able to control. Within school, she's going to add to her fuel by planning some Christmas activities with the class, and they're going to organise a secret Santa with the staff as a way of reconnecting the group. She's also going to arrange for more regular staff contact, even if it's via video call, and ensure that she takes a short walk, ideally with a colleague, a couple of times a week to ensure that she gets a break and that she's getting outside. And then professionally, she's going to add her own fuel by really taking the time to recognise and appreciate the hard work that she's been doing. So this is all about just offering herself some compassion and praise for everything that she's done over the past few months. And then minimising any existing threat, she's going to continue to work closely with her colleagues to manage the uncertain climate. And she's really going to try to be proactive in appreciating her colleagues' efforts and reminding them of what they've achieved. So again, here's a blank version which you might be able to use for your own reflections on this. Okay, and finally, this is really just a reminder that the majority of us at some point will benefit from additional support outside of the school setting. So please, if you feel you're struggling, or perhaps a colleague or loved one might be, please do seek support from your GP or your local NHS IAP service or the private sector. Every adult has access to free psychological therapy. So if you Google the borough that you work or that you live in, followed by IAP service, you should be able to find out how to access this. And often services allow you to self-refer, so you don't even have to go to your GP. We know that working in education is hugely demanding and challenging, and never more so than right now. So please do speak out and reach out. Okay, so all that's left for me to say is thank you for watching today, but also thank you for the hard work that you've been doing over the course of the year. I really hope you're able to look back and feel proud about the hard work that you've put in. Thank you.